Have you ever come home and known, without seeing, without hearing, that something was wrong? Have you ever felt it in your bones that something had entered your world and changed it forever, even before you opened the door? The snow was falling thick and fast when Reed Carson returned to his cabin in the northern mountains. The kind of snow that swallowed sound and buried footprints before you could take your next step. His boots sank with every stride, the heavy canvas pack on his back creaking under the weight of food, tools, and extra firewood. 3 days. That's how long it had taken him to reach the nearest town and come back. 3 days of wind, silence, and empty roads. He was tired. All he wanted was to light the fire, warm his hands, and forget the world for a little while. But when he reached the clearing and saw the old wood cabin standing just where he left it, something inside him tightened. The door. It was open, just a crack, swaying gently in the wind. Reed stopped. He remembered locking it. He always locked it. Not that there were many thieves this far out, but habit was habit, and it had saved him before. The wind pushed at the door now, making it creak softly against the frame. He stepped forward, slow and silent, snow crunching beneath his boots. One hand slid down to the hunting knife at his hip. Just in case. The other reached for the door. He pushed it open. His breath turned white in the cold air as he stepped inside. Silence, except not quite. The fire, it was still warm, ashes glowing faintly in the hearth. Fresh. Someone had used it. He set his pack down gently, eyes scanning the small one-room cabin. Everything looked mostly untouched. No broken glass, no scattered belongings. But then he saw it. A half-eaten piece of bread on the table. Not his. Still soft. And then the footprints. Small. Bare. They led from the fireplace across the wooden floor and vanished near the hallway. Reed crouched, studying them. Too long. Too narrow. The toes wrong, not human. His heart thudded once, deep in his chest. He rose slowly and walked down the hall. First, the bathroom. Empty. Then the storage closet. Empty. One room left, the bedroom. He paused at the door. The handle felt cold. He turned it gently and stepped inside. The bed was untouched. The window still latched, but something was off. He stood still and listened. There, a breath, quick, unsteady, from the floor. He knelt slowly and peered beneath the bed. At first, only shadows. Then, eyes, pale blue, glowing, faintly, wide with terror. A form curled beneath the bed, small, thin, female, and not from this world. Her skin was pale with a soft sheen like frost over glass. Patterns marked her cheeks, faint scales, delicate, as if nature had painted her with care and then let her break. Her long white hair was tangled, her clothes torn and gray. She was shaking. Every breath shallow, every muscle tensed. She stared at him, frozen in place. Reed stared back. He didn't move, didn't speak. Then, slowly, quietly, he knelt lower, enough to let her see his hands. Open, empty. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. She didn't answer, didn't blink. He nodded once and stood up. "I'll go make tea," he added, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. And he left the room. In the main cabin space, he lit the fire properly, careful to move slowly, deliberately. He filled the kettle, placed it on the hook, and sat down on the floor. Not the chair, not the couch, the floor. Far enough from the hallway, but close enough to be seen. And he waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. 15. Then soft sounds. A step. Another. When he looked up, she was there. Standing in the shadow of the hallway, still shaking, still watching him like a wounded animal might watch a stranger. But she was out. That mattered. Reed didn't say a word. He reached slowly to the tray beside him and placed one of the 2 mugs on the floor, halfway between them. He didn't gesture, didn't smile, just placed it there and sat back. She didn't move, but she didn't run either. The fire cracked gently. Time passed. Eventually, after what felt like 20 minutes, she stepped forward. No sound, just a small motion, bare feet on the cold wood floor. She bent slightly, picked up the cup with trembling hands and backed away. Not all the way, just enough. Then she sat, still watching, still silent. She sniffed the tea first, then took a sip. Reed stayed quiet, no questions, no movement. She drank slowly, hands wrapped tight around the cup like it was the only warmth she had known in years. That night, Reed unrolled the old guest bed in the corner. Fresh blankets, a small loaf of bread left on the table. No expectations, no words. When he turned off the lanterns and lay down, he didn't hear her move. But when he opened his eyes in the dark an hour later, she was no longer under the bed. She was asleep in the corner, curled beneath the blanket, face turned toward the fire. Snow kept falling outside, and for the first time in a long time, Reed Carson did not feel alone. Have you ever watched someone move like they're not sure the world will let them stay? Have you seen a person so quiet, so careful, that even the sound of their own steps seems like a risk? The snow had not stopped. It fell with steady grace, thick and soundless, wrapping the mountain in layers of white and hush. Reed woke early before the light broke, to the faint hiss of wind crawling through the gaps in the cabin's logs. The fire had burned low, and the warmth in the room was fading into chill. He didn't rise right away. He turned his head slowly toward the corner. The guest bed was empty, blankets folded, bowl from last night gone, bread wrapper missing. He sat up quickly, heart skipping. Gone? He checked the door, still locked. No fresh snow on the inside mat. Then he turned, crouched low, and looked beneath the bed. There she was, curled tightly again, just as she had been that first night, arms wrapped around her knees, face buried, like she had never left. But he knew better. She had. She had stepped into the room, eaten the food, taken the warmth. She had tasted a version of safety, and then she had gone back under. Reed exhaled, not in frustration, in understanding. He sat beside the bed, not close enough to threaten, but close enough for her to hear his voice without it carrying through the walls. "You came out last night," he said softly. "That's okay." No answer. "I'm not angry." Still silence. "You can come out again. I'll stay right here if you want." He didn't expect a reply, but minutes passed, and he stayed, and eventually he heard it, the sound of her breathing. Shaky, uneven, but present. "My name is Reed," he added. "I live here. I built this place after I left the city, got tired of the noise." Still nothing. Then, so quiet he almost missed it. A word, a name. Sayila. He blinked. Her voice was dry, barely above a whisper. He said it back, gently. Sayila. She didn't answer again, but he saw it. A small shift in her shoulder. A nod. That was enough. Later that morning, Reed boiled potatoes with salt. Soft food. Nothing strong. He placed the bowl on the floor near the fire and returned to his chair. He didn't look at her. Didn't speak. He waited. 10 minutes later, she emerged again, moving like smoke, like shadow. She took the bowl, sat near the fire, curled into herself, holding the warmth between her fingers. She didn't speak, but she ate. She watched him with cautious eyes, every movement noted, every sound catalogued, like an animal long trained to sense danger and kindness. Reed didn't force anything. He let the silence fill the room. Because sometimes silence is louder than speech. That night, the same rhythm repeated. He set up the bed, left food, left light, then lay down and waited. When he awoke, she was not under the bed. She was asleep, curled again, this time with the blanket pulled higher, her breathing steadier. By the fourth day, she stepped out sooner, sat a little closer, still never met his eyes. But she didn't flinch when he shifted in his chair. Progress came, not in leaps, but inches. He left a small brush beside the cup one evening. Didn't say anything. The next morning, the brush was gone, and her hair, though still tangled, was no longer wild. It was a message, clear as spoken words. She was trying. Reed saw it, but he also saw the shadow still clinging to her eyes. Every time the wind howled too loud, she jumped. Every time a branch tapped the window, she flinched. Every time he stood too fast, she tensed like she expected pain. It wasn't him she feared. Not anymore. It was everything she had known before him. That night, she sat near the fire while Reed placed logs into the hearth. He moved too quickly, just a step too close. She gasped and scrambled backward, nearly falling. Reed froze. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, dropping the log to the floor. She looked away, clutching the edge of the blanket. He knelt slowly, showing his hands. "I didn't mean to scare you." Still nothing. So he backed up, sat down far across the room. "I won't come near unless you want me to." Her hands trembled, but she nodded once. That night, Reed left a soft wool scarf folded near the fire. He didn't say why. The next morning, it was wrapped around her neck. When she looked up at him, just for a moment, it was not fear he saw. It was exhaustion. And something else. Maybe trust, thin as thread. But there. She was still hiding. But not from him. From the world. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that this small cabin buried deep in a mountain of snow might be a place where no one would hurt her again. Have you ever sat beside someone for days, sharing warmth, food, silence, and still not known the sound of their voice? Have you ever wondered what it takes to make someone believe they're not broken just because they've been hurt? The snow outside had become a constant rhythm. Day after day it fell, painting the woods in layers of white that muffled even the birds. Inside the cabin, time slowed. Meals were simple, movements quieter. Words still were rare. Sayla didn't speak, not in full, not yet, but she no longer hid, no longer curled beneath the bed or flinched at every shift in the shadows. She had claimed a quiet corner of the cabin as hers, just beneath the south window near the stove. She arranged her blanket there each evening, and every morning she folded it with careful precision, mimicking how Reed folded his. There were small signs. When Reed yawned, she yawned seconds later. When he stirred the soup, she mirrored the motion with her spoon. Even the way she sat, legs crossed, hands resting on her knees, had begun to echo him. He noticed, but he didn't say anything, not yet. She was watching him not just with her eyes, but with her entire being, watching how to live, how to be, and she was learning. One morning, Reed sat at the old table, reading from a cracked leather book. It was a children's tale, something simple and comforting. He wasn't reading aloud, just flipping pages, letting the quiet soak through. He felt her gaze before he looked up. Sayla was sitting cross-legged, watching him closely. Not afraid, just curious. He smiled gently and slid the book across the table. "It's a story," he said, "about a bird learning to fly again after its wings were broken." She reached out slowly, touched the pages like they were made of glass, then turned one. Her glowing eyes scanned the letters, hesitant, uncertain. "You know these?" he asked. She gave the smallest nod. So Reed opened to the first page and began to read. His voice low, calm, unhurried. The story wasn't long, just a few dozen lines, but she never looked away. When he reached the final word and closed the book, her hands stayed on it, gently gripping the cover. That night, after dinner, Reed heard something strange. A sound, faint and fragile, drifting through the cabin like mist. He turned. Ciela was sitting by the fire. She was humming. Not a song with words, just a pattern of tones, rising and falling like memory itself. It was beautiful. Unsteady, yes, but filled with a quiet longing that made the air feel sacred. Reed didn't speak, didn't move. He just listened. When the sound faded, he asked softly, "Was that a song?" She paused, eyes wide, unsure if she had done something wrong, then nodded. "You sing?" She looked down. "I'd like to hear it again sometime." She didn't answer, but she stayed by the fire a little longer that night. The next morning, she left something on the table beside his cup of tea. A stone, small, smooth, blue, not valuable, not rare, but chosen. He picked it up carefully. She said nothing, but he understood. She was thanking him. From then on, small exchanges began to happen. He left a clean cloth. She took it. She folded his blanket once when he forgot. He carved her a small wooden comb. She used it. They never spoke of these things, but they mattered. They were the language between them. And yet, beneath it all, Reed could still see it. The fear, not of him, not anymore, but of the world, of memory. One evening, as the fire burned low, he stepped too close while adding wood. A misstep, a mistake. She gasped, flinched, pulled back. He froze, hand hovering. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have warned you." She didn't reply. She didn't run. But her shoulders were tight, her hands clenched. He backed away, gave her space, and that night he left a note beside her scarf. Just a few words. "You never have to be afraid of me." The next morning, when he awoke, the note was gone, and her scarf was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Later, as they shared breakfast, she finally spoke. One word. "Why?" Reed looked up. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Because no one should be afraid in their own home," he said. "Not ever." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked down and whispered, "Me neither." That was the first time he'd heard her voice at full volume. Not a whisper, not a breath, but a sentence. Her voice was soft, cracked at the edges but strong in the middle. It wasn't much, but it was everything. From that day things changed, just a little. Ciela began sitting closer to the fire. She watched the snow with more calm than tension. When Reed made tea, she brought the cups. They didn't talk often, but silence no longer felt like hiding. It felt like presence. And every so often, Reed would glance up from his book and find her watching him, not with fear, but with something softer, something like wonder. And for the first time in a long, long while, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting for someone to sit in that silence with him all along. Have you ever lied without hesitation, not for yourself, but for someone who had nothing left to hide behind? Have you ever stood at your own door, knowing what waited on the other side wasn't just danger, but a test of the kind of person you still were? It began with the lights, a flicker, just once, then again. Reed was writing in his journal beside the fire, the glow of the flame casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Ciela lay nearby, wrapped in the thick wool blanket he had given her a week ago. Her breathing was slow and steady, her hands folded beneath her cheek. For once she looked peaceful, almost weightless. Then the lights dipped again, sharper this time. Reed looked up. The fire was fine, the wind hadn't picked up, but something felt off. He stood and walked to the window. The glass was fogged from inside, but beyond it, through the film of condensation, he saw color. Not orange, not white, not the pale blue of starlight, green, then violet, then a strange pulse of red, not from Earth. He stepped back. Before he could speak, Sayla stirred. She sat up fast, no confusion, only stillness, and then her voice low and quiet. "They found me." Reed's blood went cold. "Who?" She didn't answer. She crawled to the far wall, pressed her ear against the wooden paneling, her eyes focused, her body rigid. "They're above us," she said. "They're scanning." He moved to her side. "What do we do?" She turned, fear deep in her glowing eyes. "You hide me." There was no time to hesitate. Reed ran to the kitchen, pulled up the old floorboard beneath the pantry. Years ago, he had hollowed out the crawl space for emergencies, just in case of storms or wild animals. He never thought he'd need it for this. Sayla climbed in without protest. She curled tightly, and he covered her with blankets, then closed the board, shifting the rug back into place. Not a second too soon. A knock echoed at the door, not a human knock, sharp, mechanical. Reed stepped toward it slowly. His heart was a fist in his chest. He opened the door. Two figures stood there, tall, clad in black armor with reflective masks that hid their faces. Strange symbols shimmered on their chest plates. One of them held up a glowing panel. A hologram flared to life. An image of Sayla, wild-eyed, dirt-streaked, bound in chains. "Have you seen this fugitive?" one of them asked. The voice was filtered, robotic, cold. Reed narrowed his eyes. Number. "What's she done?" "She is property, escaped from her owners. She is dangerous." He let the word sit for a second. Then, calmly, he replied, "I live alone. No one's come here in months." There was a pause. Then one of them stepped forward. "Permission to search?" Reed opened the door wider. They moved like shadows, scanning with long rods and tiny blinking devices. They checked the bedroom, the loft, even inside the chimney, but not the floor. Not the place where Sayla was holding her breath beneath layers of wood and silence. Reed stood still, arms folded. His pulse was pounding, but his face didn't show it. After 5 long minutes, the masked soldier stepped back toward the door. "If you see her," he said, "report immediately." "Of course," Reed said. His voice never wavered. The two figures turned and disappeared into the snow. Moments later, a massive ship lifted silently above the trees, disappearing into the clouds. Only when the sound vanished completely did Reed move. He rushed to the kitchen, pulled up the board. "Sayla," he whispered. 2 hands emerged, then her face. She was crying. "You lied for me," she whispered. "Of course I did," he said, helping her up. "You're not theirs." She stood, still shaking, and leaned into the wall. "I've never been safe before," she said. "You are now." That night, she didn't sleep in the corner. She lay on the guest bed, head resting on the pillow, body wrapped in warmth. Her breath came easy. Her eyes stayed closed. Reed sat near the window, rifle across his lap, watching the woods, because danger had come once, and might again. But this time, Sayla would not be alone. Have you ever carried a name so heavy with sorrow that speaking it aloud felt like reopening a wound? What happens when someone offers you safety, not just of the body but of the soul, and you finally find the strength to say who you really are? The morning after the knock, the mountain was quiet again. Snow still fell in slow drifting curtains, but the wind had died down. The forest outside was motionless, blanketed in white like a world paused mid-breath. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Reed stirred a pot of soup in the kitchen. The quiet was welcome, but not easy. He kept glancing over his shoulder, watching Sayla where she sat on the floor beside the hearth, knees pulled up to her chest, scarf draped across her shoulders. She hadn't spoken since he pulled her from the crawl space. Not even to thank him again, not even a whisper. She was present but distant, holding something in. He didn't press, didn't ask. He'd learned that much. But even silence has weight, and this one was pressing harder than the snow on the roof. He placed a cup of tea near her and stepped back. She didn't look up, just stared into the fire. Later, when he sat at the table with his old leather journal, she finally moved. She stood slowly, crossed the cabin with measured steps, and lowered herself into the chair across from him. Her voice came quiet and flat. "I didn't sleep." Reed nodded. "I didn't expect you to. I dreamed of chains again." His hand stilled on the page. He set the pen down. She stared at the grain of the table, her fingers tightening slightly. "I never told you my name," she said. "You didn't have to. But you should know." He nodded once, not rushing. She took a long breath. "My full name is Sailavari Darikan." The syllables fell like a secret spell. Reed said nothing. Let the name settle in the air like snow on bare branches. She continued. "I wasn't always a fugitive. I was born to House Dari, second line of the Veldikari bloodline. I grew up in a palace made of crystal and stone, where the sky was gold at sunset, and the rivers whispered to the cliffs." Reed looked at her, not like a legend, not like a miracle, but like a person. She didn't meet his eyes. "When war came, our gates burned. My mother and her guards fought while I was hidden in the vault. They told me to stay quiet. I did." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "They found me anyway." She gripped the edge of the table. "I was 13 the first time I was sold." Reed clenched his jaw, but kept still. "I was passed from one system to another. Some wanted a servant, some wanted worse. I escaped 4 times. Each time I was found, beaten, returned." Her eyes were wet now, but she didn't cry. "This was the 5th escape, and I didn't think I'd survive the snow." Reed reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. She stared at it like it was something she'd never seen before. "Sailavari," he said, voice low. "You're safe now. I meant that." She looked up at him slowly. "Even if they come again? I'll fight for you." She blinked hard. A tear slipped down her cheek. "You don't even know what I am." "You're Saela," he said simply. "That's enough." She stared for a long time, then stood, left the room. He thought maybe that was the end of it. But a few minutes later she returned, holding something wrapped in cloth. She walked over and pressed it into his hands. "What is it?" he asked. "My bloodline crystal," she said. "It proves who I am." He began to hand it back, but she shook her head. "If they catch me and I die, I want you to have it." Reed's voice dropped. "You're not going to die." But she pressed his fingers closed around the crystal. "I trust you," she said, "even if I don't understand why." That night Selah sang, not the humming she'd done before, not the whispers that vanished before they formed. This was different. Her voice was low, deep, not loud but full. It vibrated like a memory rising from beneath centuries of silence. The language was not one Reed knew. The melody was strange, but the feeling, it was unmistakable. Longing, grief, a song for those who had no graves. He sat with his eyes closed, listening. When the final note faded into the logs and the wind outside, the cabin didn't feel like just a shelter anymore. It felt like something closer to a sanctuary. Far above the clouds, in the sky that had grown still again, a ship hovered, silent and distant. It traced a signal left behind by the bloodline crystal now lying in Reed's coat pocket. It hadn't locked on yet, but it would. The fire burned lower. Selah curled near it, her hands folded beneath her cheek, her breathing steady. Reed didn't sleep. Not yet. He sat beside the window, the weight of the crystal in his hand, and watched the stars blink slowly above the trees. Have you ever stood beside someone not because you had to, but because leaving them behind would have meant losing the last part of yourself that still believed in decency? Would you choose to stay, even knowing that doing so could get you killed? The sunrise came red. Not the warm red of dawn, not the soft glow that promised a new day, but the deep, bruised red of warning. The kind that stretched across the snow like blood seeping through cotton. Reed was outside, chopping the last of the winter wood, steam rising from his breath, axe biting into frozen logs. The air was too still, too sharp. He paused between swings, instinct whispering beneath the surface of his skin. He wiped the back of his glove across his brow and turned his gaze toward the tree line. Nothing moved, not the birds, not the wind. And then he heard it. A hum, low at first, then deeper, wider. It rolled across the forest like thunder with no storm, a vibration that didn't shake the earth, but the air itself. Reed turned, saw the treetops begin to sway, not from wind, but from something descending. A ship, big, black, slow. It hovered above the clearing, its hull dark as coal, shaped like a claw reaching toward the cabin. No lights, no insignias, only presence. He dropped the axe, ran inside. Sayela was already standing. She gripped the edge of the table, her eyes locked on the window, her whole body stiff. "They're here," she whispered. Reed didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He crossed the room, reached for the rifle mounted on the wall. Not much, but better than nothing. "They won't take you," he said. Sayela didn't look at him. Her voice was calm, but final. "They won't try to take me, Reed. That's not what this is." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're not here to bring me back. They're here to erase me." Reed's chest tightened. "Then we hide." "No," she said, turning to him. "You hide. I'm not leaving you." "You don't understand," she said, stepping closer. "If they find me, they'll destroy this place. Level it. You'll die for nothing." "I'm not hiding." She stared at him for a long time. Then something changed in her eyes. Not fear, fire. "I'm done running," she said. "If they want to take my voice, they'll have to fight for it." She stepped toward the door. Reed followed. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow, like the sky itself mourned what was coming. Outside, the ship began to descend fully, landing in the clearing just beyond the wood line. Steam hissed from its sides as metal touched snow. A ramp lowered with mechanical precision. 3 soldiers emerged, tall, masked, clad in dark armor with no markings. One raised a weapon. Sayela took a step forward. Reed stayed by her side. "My name is Sayelavari Dari Khan," she said, voice ringing against the trees, "and I am not your slave." The lead soldier froze. A voice answered, filtered sharp. "You are marked for erasure." Sayela stood taller. "Then come try." They moved fast, too fast. Reed fired the rifle, the shot cracking like lightning. He missed, but it sent one soldier sprawling. Sayela didn't flinch. She ran, not away, but toward the trees, drawing the soldiers after her. She moved like someone reborn, ducking, spinning, faster than Reed had ever seen. She struck one down with the broken fire poker she'd hidden behind the porch. Sparks flew, screams echoed. Reed reloaded, fired again, hit the scanner on the ship. The panel burst, shorting out in a cascade of sparks. One soldier screamed and fell. Only one remained. He lunged at Sayela. She spun, used his momentum against him, and slammed the iron rod across the side of his helmet. The impact sent him sprawling into the snow, groaning. The air pulsed. The ship's engines overloaded. A moment later, fire erupted from its side. The explosion rose like a second sun behind the trees, lighting the woods in gold and heat and ash. Silence fell again, unnatural, absolute. Sayla walked back slowly, her arm bleeding, her body trembling, but her face steady. Reed met her halfway. "You're hurt. I'll live." She smiled, small, crooked, but real. They stood there amid the smoke and falling snow as pieces of the ship burned quietly in the clearing. Later, Reed stitched her wound with hands steadier than his heart. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, only watched him. When he finished, she looked down at her arm, then at him. "You could leave now," she said. "They won't come again." He didn't answer right away, then he shook his head. "No." She looked surprised. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said. "I don't want to run, not from them, not from myself, and not from this." She gestured toward the cabin, toward the fire, toward him. "This is my home now." Reed looked at her, something deep moving behind his eyes. "Are you sure?" She stepped closer. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, she didn't sit across the fire. She sat beside him. Wrapped in a blanket, shoulder touching his, the firelight dancing across both of their faces. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, something had settled. Something stronger than fear, something warmer than safety. For the first time, Sayla wasn't surviving. She was choosing. Have you ever watched someone relearn how to live, not in grand moments, but in the smallest acts of trust? Have you ever seen someone begin to return to themselves, piece by piece, and realized you are becoming whole right alongside them? The days after the fire passed quietly. The wreckage from the ship still smoldered in the woods, a black skeleton half buried in snow, but it no longer pulsed with danger. No new visitors came. No voices whispered from the tree line. The mountains were silent again, but the silence felt different now. Less like hiding, more like breathing. Inside the cabin, Sayla moved freely. There was no longer hesitation in her steps, no retreating to the corners. She swept the floors without prompting. She adjusted the firewood when it burned too fast. One afternoon, she even stirred the stew pot on her own while Reed read by the window. It was simple, ordinary, but it felt like magic. Reed watched her closely, never pressing, never demanding. And Sayla responded not with words, but with rhythm. She began humming again, soft melodies that changed with her mood, some hopeful, some hollow, all hers. He never interrupted, he only listened. One morning, while cleaning the shelves above the stove, Sayla reached up and accidentally knocked over a jar. It crashed to the floor and shattered, scattering dried herbs across the wood. She froze. Her body tensed in that old way. Reed looked up from across the room. He saw her shoulders locked, saw the way her hands curled at her sides. "It's all right," he said gently. She didn't speak, just stared at the mess like it was a punishment waiting to fall. Reed stood slowly, walked over, crouched beside her. "No harm done," he said. "We'll clean it together." He picked up a handful of leaves, brushed them into a pile. After a moment, she joined him. Knees to the floor, her hair falling forward, they worked in silence, but her breathing was steady. That night, she left a small item on his chair. A carving, crude but clear. Two figures, one tall, one smaller, sitting beneath the outline of a fire. It didn't need a caption. He understood. She had begun to see this place as not just a hiding spot, but a home. One evening, as snow dusted the windows, Sayla stood by the table with her hair tied back. She had brushed it smooth, a small clip holding it in place. She wore one of Reed's flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled carefully, a loose scarf tied at her neck. "You look comfortable," he said, smiling. She shrugged, but her eyes shone. I'm trying. I can see that. She moved to the counter and lifted a pot from the stove. Tonight I cook, she said. The words were simple, but Reed felt their weight. They ate by firelight, soup, toasted bread, mint tea. Afterward, Reed pulled out an old book and began to read again. This time, she sat beside him, her chin resting on her hand, eyes moving across the pages as he read aloud. When he finished the story, she leaned back and said, I used to read. I'm not surprised. In my family's library, the scrolls were thousands of years old. Some glowed in the dark. He chuckled softly. Well, mine's just a paperback, but you're welcome to it. She smiled, small but real. I like this better. Later, as Reed prepared the fire for the night, Sayela returned to her spot by the window. She looked out at the darkness, then turned to him. You've never asked me why I stayed. He paused, setting a log gently into place. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She walked toward him, step steady. I stayed because, when I was with them, I was nothing, a thing, a task to be completed, a burden to be moved. Her voice was clear now, strong. But here, you looked at me like I was a person, even when I couldn't speak, even when I was shaking, even when I was hiding. Reed stood slowly. You are a person, Sayela. She nodded. I just forgot. For a long time. There was silence between them then, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memory and choice, and something warm beginning to root. That night, she didn't curl up across the room. She sat beside Reed, close enough for her head to rest lightly on his shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let her be there. Outside, the wind returned, brushing snow against the walls. But inside, the cabin was filled with the quiet hum of a life being reclaimed, one moment at a time. If this story touched you, let us know. What moment stayed with you most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Some names we are given. Others we earn through fire, silence, and the long road back to trust. And then, sometimes we choose one for ourselves. Not because we need a new identity, but because we finally feel free enough to claim who we've become. The snow had melted just enough to uncover patches of dark earth beneath the trees. It wasn't spring yet, not quite, but something had shifted. Sayela stood barefoot on the porch, her eyes closed, her face turned toward the wind. It carried the scent of pine and something cleaner, less burdened. For the first time in weeks, she didn't wrap herself in scarves or heavy clothes. Her feet touched the boards like she belonged there. Behind her, inside the cabin, Reed was drying dishes. The radio played static and fragments of an old melody. The fire crackled quietly. It was evening, but not dark yet. That golden hour when the world held its breath and the light turned everything honest. Sayela turned to the door. I want to show you something, she said. Reed looked up. All right? She held out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was the crystal, the bloodline marker. It pulsed softly with a pale violet light, the very object that had nearly led to her death. I want you to keep it, she said. You already gave this to me. Not for safekeeping, for keeping Reed blinked. Why now? She looked out across the trees. Because I'm not afraid of what it means anymore. And because if something happens to me, I want the person who saw me first as a person, not a legacy, to have it. Reed stepped closer. You're not going anywhere. I know, she said. But she pressed it into his hands anyway. And this time, he didn't give it back. That night, she cooked again. It wasn't perfect. The soup was too salty, the bread a little too crisp. But Reed didn't say a word about that. He just smiled, watching her focus, her movements relaxed now, unguarded. After they ate, they sat near the fire, not across from each other, but side by side. She pulled her knees up and rested her head against his shoulder. "I think," she said, "I want to stay." "You already are." "No, I mean for real. I don't want to be Selavari Dari Khan anymore. Not because I'm ashamed, but because that name was born in a palace built on rules and titles and things I don't need anymore." Reed turned to her. "So, who do you want to be?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "Sayla Carson." Reed's heart slowed. He didn't speak right away. He knew what the name meant, what she was offering, not ownership, not obligation, something deeper. "Are you sure?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes glowing softly. "I'm choosing it, like I chose to stay, like I chose you." He reached over, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then I'll make sure it's a name worth having." The days passed gently after that. They built a small garden plot when the snow melted completely, planted herbs, found wild onions near the stream. Reed taught her how to sand wood without splinters. She taught him how to listen to silence in a way he never had before. They read stories by firelight. Sometimes she would hum. Sometimes he would tell her a joke so dry it took her a moment to realize he wasn't serious. But when she laughed, it was a sound that felt like it belonged in that cabin, like it had always been meant to live there. One evening, while watching the stars through the open window, Sayla said, "I used to think home was something with walls and gates and guards. And now? Now I know it's where you're not afraid to sleep." She fell asleep on the couch that night, wrapped in Reed's old flannel shirt, her hair a little messy, her mouth slightly open. Reed stayed up writing in his notebook, a habit he never shook. On the last page, he wrote, "She came here running, but she doesn't run anymore. She came with a name full of pain and now wears one full of choice. And when I look at her, I don't see an alien. I see someone who saved me too. Not from soldiers or war, but from silence. From forgetting what it meant to care." The next morning, they sat on the porch with mugs of tea, listening to the wind. Sayla leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think we're going to be okay," she said. Reed nodded. "I think we already are." If you've ever believed someone deserved to be more than what the world called them, share this story. And if a moment touched you, let us know in the comments. Sometimes a single voice is all it takes to keep someone else from hiding.